Hey guys, welcome back. So now we're getting back into the Darkhold series with Darkhold Wasp, which takes us into the mind of Janet Van Dyne, and it more or less gives us the story that we were expecting. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so for this one, with us getting into the Darkhold story for Janet Van Dyne, I first want to point out that for each one of these stories that we're seeing come to life in the minds of these heroes, just from reading a portion of the Darkhold, that even though these stories are being manifested from the combination of chaos magic combined with the insanity that the reader is thrown into by design, but I want you to keep in mind that these stories hold a level of truth in every case and every instance, which is essentially what makes the insanity part work. And I want to pick this apart a little bit because with these stories, throwing the heroes' minds into chaos and altering their physical appearance by throwing each of them into these dark stories that are so close to the truth, to the point of where it causes each reader to believe that at some point in time they could see themselves actually taking this path. Like Tony, for example. His Darkhold story took the truth of how he became Iron Man, with him barely making it home with his life, and it flipped the true story of his survival on its head by digging into him fearing for his life and going overboard with the Iron Man suit innovations, and even to the extent of where it costed the lives of those who were closest to him. And we can even say the same for Blade, because even though in his case the world that was crafted around his Darkhold story, like it was more of an extension of the first Blade film that had just landed in the main Marvel universe, but even in his case we got the truth of Blade's insecurities and fears of him not being sure if he just really loves killing. And with that being the case, and the whole mystery in that story of whether he was Lamagra or not, it also just shows us that Blade, he struggles with the idea of if he didn't have his serum to keep the thirst at bay, then no one would know the difference between who he truly is and a monstrous blood god. Because if certain circumstances aligned and the majority of the people of Earth were turned to vampires, he can already see himself, much like Lamagra, carving a path to taking over the world because he believes that it needs his leadership. And for both Tony and Blade, you can kind of see how these Darkhold stories are driving them mad, because in a way it's almost like the book is telling them, like, let me know or tell me with a straight face that you wouldn't become this or you wouldn't do that if a couple things had played out differently. Because we create our identities from the things we've done and the places we've been, but if our past or that story changes or that truth changes, then we're just likely to transform into something completely different as well. Because again, often we create our identities from our experiences. And so for this one with Janet Van Dyne, her story mainly focuses on the experience of her abusive marriage with Hank Pym. And with the way that this is done, it starts off before we had actually seen the abuse turn physical back in Avengers issue 213. But also it takes place after Janet had become the Wasp and her and Hank got married, which is really when she got a closer look at a lot of his toxic traits, like him often not wearing his ring, which he says is more of a safety thing with him needing to take it off in the lab, but aside from that he would often ignore her and then lash out at the start of nearly every conversation. But this really starts to pick up when the Avengers respond to Kang the Conqueror breaking into a museum, which we find out is in order to steal an artifact from ancient Egypt that holds more of a sentimental value to Kang from his time there. And when this happens, Kang, he overthrows the Avengers for the most part by just taking over Iron Man's suit and using Tony to attack the other Avengers and catch them all off guard. And after using Tony to attack the Avengers, he just shuts Iron Man down. But before he can get to what he came for, he's then attacked by Janet. And when this happens, it sparks a bit of an interesting conversation, because with Kang, of course, knowing the Avengers, he brings up Janet's relationship with Hank Pym, and he more or less calls her out. And the way that he does this, it's like he lets her know, like, hey, you're out here being real aggressive. Like, could that be because there's some issues within the marriage? Which at this point for Janet, there definitely is. But for the most part for Janet, right now it's just putting up with Hank's mood swings, or him just yelling, or just locking himself away in the lab for hours. But even still, you can tell Kang knows what he's doing by even bringing it up. But then for Janet, with her telling Kang more or less that he's just a villain and he don't know nothing about feelings, but Kang lets her know au contraire. Because back during his time in Egypt, there was a woman who he was deeply in love with, and he lets Janet know that she reminds him of her, with her being filled of so much sorrow, which for Kang filled him with delight because he knew that only he could take care of her. And when saying this, Kang then asks Janet, is there someone taking care of you, just before he leaves? And you can tell when this happens that it leaves this thought in Janet's mind, which had really already been there at this point, but it agitates the idea for Janet that she simply just deserves better. because even at this time when Hank was spending ridiculous hours in the lab, which aside from him improving his equipment, most of this time spent back then was him trying to make something better because he felt like he hadn't done anything significant since his discovery of PIM particles. And early on, this is something that we would see a lot, with Hank just disappearing and quote-unquote abandoning the team in order to work on his next breakthrough, which is exactly what led us to getting Ultron in the first place. But in this case, with this Darkhold story, for the most part, it's dealing with events that had taken place during and after Avengers issue 181, when the National Security Council had sent out Henry Peter Gyrich to downsize the Avengers to only 7 members. And really this had happened because prior to this, the government would just let the Avengers slide because they're the heroes, but with the number of incidents piling up and the roster growing super huge, over time they just couldn't keep track. But also with this selection, the National Security Council, they picked the 7 heroes who would remain Avengers off of their uniqueness and special abilities, established loyalties, and other guidelines that just fell under government regulations. But within this selection, they picked Iron Man, the Vision, Captain America, Scarlet Witch, Beast, the Wasp, and Falcon. And in the case of Falcon, I believe it was a thing at the time to where the council had kind of shoved him in there for diversity purposes. But I wanted to point this out to kind of set the stage a bit better, because at the time of this story, Janet is effectively still an Avenger, but Hank isn't. And it's not like before when he would just leave when he wanted to, he was cut from the roster. And even though he initially told her that he didn't mind the switch up, but not too long after his actions would show differently, with him expressing resentment and taking that out on Janet. But at the time he was trying to cover it up by just saying that he could use the extra time in the lab. But it's also during this time within the Darkhold version of the story, to where Janet recalls Hank's mood swings, his over dedication to his work, to where at that time she even suggested that they take a vacation together, but he shot that idea down. But even after, with them getting back into a regular conversation, he'd quickly get frustrated and push her away. But then after this, it's here where we then jump forward again, after a point to where the government had allowed Hank Pym to join back with the Avengers, and it's during this time where they're celebrating at the Avengers mansion, with Hank coming back to the team, and it's here where we see Janet have a conversation with Pepper, who initially just asked Janet like how are her and Hank doing, and Janet lets her know like, you know, things could be better, and Pepper's more or less like, well, yeah, that's marriage. But then it's here where Pepper makes the suggestion to Janet that her and Hank should go on a vacation, take some time away, before things pick up and Hank is fully back into action. And Janet lets her know she suggested a trip, but Hank had just shut the whole idea down. But then when Pepper tells Janet that she should do something for herself at the very least, because if not, who else is going to take care of you? And it's right there where Janet immediately remembers her conversation with Kang. And here we jump forward some time with us also seeing Janet thinking about Hank's behavior and how in moments when he couldn't own up to something, he would then just blame it on her. But then also with this montage of Janet's thoughts, which looks back and then goes forward into an upcoming event after Hank had rejoined the Avengers, which had taken place within Avengers issue 212, where at the time a warrior by the name of Gorn of Belusia had been killed by 2 police officers. And after his death, Linnea, the Elf Queen, she had then just went on a rampage in order to make the world pay for her loss. But also when this happened and the Avengers responded, it came down to a moment where Captain America avoided her magic and he positioned himself right behind her in the perfect place to attack. But for Captain America, by not attacking, he was trying to show her that he wanted to talk the situation out. But it was also in this moment when the Elf Queen had her back turned and Hank Pym had hit her with his bioelectrical sting, which barely phased her. But right after this happened, before she could drop a vehicle on Hank's head, Janet had then came through and saved him, and Hank at the time was pissed. He was like, why her? But this is the event that's pretty much referenced as we go back into Janet's Darkhold story, and it's here where we pick up after this when Hank had a meeting with the Avengers when he was reprimanded and informed by Thor that under the charges that Captain America had brought up, Hank Pym would later face a court-martial. But also while this meeting is going on, Janet is just outside, and in a very similar way to Avengers issue 213, we see a conversation take place here between Tigra and Janet. But though it's laid out pretty much the same way, the conversation in this Darkhold story, it plays out a bit different, because starting here with Janet, she's waiting right outside, she's nervous, and she's kind of taking this in and asking herself like, when will you wake up? And when she says this out loud, Tigra overhears her. But long story short, it pretty much leads into this conversation of Tigra checking on Janet, and Janet opens up. She admits that it's a tough situation and she is disappointed. But also when them talking here and Tigra being fairly new to the Avengers roster, like she doesn't know Hank too well, so she's not really acquainted with the red flags. But while she's talking to Janet here, she lets Janet know like she couldn't imagine what it's like being married to a superhero. But at one point in time for Tigra, she was married to a cop, and though they didn't see eye to eye on a number of things, they always had each other's backs. But with saying this, Tigra lets Janet know that when she was with her husband that there was also no fear, because she doesn't believe that fear has a place in marriage, and in this moment she's worried that Janet's afraid. And as soon as Tigra says this, Hank comes storming out, and it's here we see Janet asking him what happened. And much like before, Hank snatches his arm and tells Janet to leave him alone, but this time when Hank gives Janet the news, telling her what Cap, Thor, and Iron Man said as far as Hank getting ready to be court-martialed, and it's here where Hank holds Janet and he tells her, "I am afraid." So where right in that moment, Janet just looks over Hank's shoulder at Tigra and Janet says nothing, which is quite the departure from Avengers issue 213 when Janet did respond when she had pretty much lied and told Hank that she doesn't care, she's not afraid, and she gave Hank words of comfort telling him to hold her. And with the Janet of this story just veering further and further from the path from the classic Janet who just kept turning the other cheek, and it's here where we come to the part that's leading to the infamous moment when Janet gets up in the middle of the night to head down to the lab and check on Hank, who at this point was salvaging components from Ultron to place in his new creation, Salvation 1, which in this case was made out of all adamantium, but it was designed to detect and attack the Avengers so that Hank can swoop in and save the day and hopefully save his career, because he had also built into it a secret weak spot that only he knew about. And for the most part, this scene or this moment, it plays out the same, because when she flies down, she's detected on her way in, and much like before, Hank accuses her of spying on him, but in this case, with Salvation 1 being much earlier in its development, we pretty much skipped the whole part of Hank making the robot attack Janet in order to see how effective it is, but in her story, it continues with a portion of her trying to talk him out of it and him attacking her in response. And it's right here for Janet where the darkness just takes over, because when Janet sees her hand with the broken shards of glass in it, she then grabs a larger piece of glass and her eyes then turn red. And it's almost as if here when this happens that she goes into stinger mode, as if the biological modifications that Hank had given her back when she first became the Wasp and she got her wings, and it's like in this story that true Wasp, to where in the case a female Wasp can sting multiple times, had more or less come to the surface and really a lot like an actual Queen Wasp that would only sting and do multiple stings in an act of self-defense. And with how this is done, it's almost like this entire time, like Janet has been going against her nature all the way up to this moment, which was pretty much her breaking point. And after she kills Hank, it's then in this moment when she truly feels free. And it's like for Janet, in this moment you can tell like this is the part of the Darkhold story where the book is more or less tugging on her and it's causing her to look at herself and answer the question of like, if this had actually played out this way, how would you honestly feel? And I wouldn't be surprised if she actually did want to kill him at times. And now with her reading and experiencing this story, that's likely the part that's driving her crazy, because she knows had a few small things played out slightly different, then truth be told, she could have seen herself doing this. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all your support. And for anyone who's new here, if you want more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below to where you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.